Good morning, students. Or I guess it's really again this afternoon. Um, I've not done this very much in the past. In fact, for all purposes, I really haven't done it, meaning I've never taught a class outside, but I decided today that I would actually come outside in my screen area, my porch area, and finish the play with you. It's very nice out, and it certainly is a nice change of pace from being indoors. If you get an opportunity, all of you go out. Very nice today. Hope again you're doing well. I still want to remind you now, go ahead and watch the videos, because after today we will have finished the play, and then next week we will have a major exam over the Merchant of Venice. And what I want you to do is, some of you had a little bit of difficulty with the first major exam, you remember, before we went on break, and you want to do particularly well on this one. This is one of the reasons why I'm spending as much time in terms of the play, letting you have an opportunity to undergo any adjustment that you may need to. So by the time I finish the fourth act, I'm going to make an announcement. So I lure you into watching the entire video. So again, what I want to do is to draw conclusions to the Merchant of Venice. And after my video today, I will have completed the play. And then what remains is something that I will call your attention to on Monday. So we finished the drawings, meaning the three casket or chest stories. You have seen the outcome. Bassanio has made his choice. And now the scene in Act 4, Scene 1, shifts to Venice. So we see where Shakespeare has come in terms of the play. And our concern here will be what happens in terms of Shylock and what he wants to do in regard to claiming his, shall we quote, pound of flesh. And by the time we finish Act 4, I remind you, again, all of the requirements necessary in terms of looking at the play as tragicomedy will have been fulfilled. And what remains is for us to put a few finishing touches as we look in terms of Act 5. So let me begin. I'm in Act 4, Scene 1, and I'll look at the opening lines. A kind of presiding figure is the character of the Duke. And I would like to call your attention to his passage as you begin Scene 1 of Act 4. He says, "I am sorry for thee. Thou art come to answer a stony adversary, an inhuman wretch, incapable of pity, void and empty from any dram of mercy." Now, this is going to be one of the reasons why I said that the play, too, might be viewed as a kind of problem play. Some contend all this Duke has to do is to stand up and say, no. Shylock is not due in any way because of how ridiculous his demand is. He is not due, if you will, his pound of flesh. But Shakespeare has learned, since he has written Romeo and Juliet, that regardless, there must be a sense of law in terms of governing, shall we say, a society, a country. And the Duke really has the legal right to uphold the law of Venice. For one thing, you have to remember now, Shylock, Antonio, they agreed It's a mutual thing. Both of them agreed to enter into this, shall we say, contract. Remember that Shylock was very careful to say that the contract would be notarized. So, in a kind of legal way, everything is on initially the side of Shylock. Now, what I want to call your attention to is, can you imagine, as Shylock is going to enter the court scene, how he may be treated? In other words, I would have to say, as a kind of understatement, that public opinion is readily against him. And you would hear a number of jeers and boos, so forth, as Shylock is making his way into the trial booth. And some say, and it would be played differently. I would like to encourage all of you, if you get an opportunity, to maybe check out a video, meaning of the play itself, so you could see how this act would be presented on stage. And if you want a kind of good current version, I would call your attention to the Al Pacino version of the play, of The Merchant of Venice. So if you get an opportunity, do look at Act 4, for that matter, if you want to view the entire play. Others say that Shylock will enter, and he will have some of his, I'll use the word rather loosely, he may actually have some of his friends, some of his fellow money lenders with him. But again, it depends on the nature of the production. Probably for all purposes, Shylock will enter by himself. And I would call your attention now to about line 35. Shylock remains very confident, very steadfast. The idea, and I begin the passage with you, reading, I have possessed your grace of what I purpose, and by our holy Sabbath have I sworn to have the due and forfeit of my bond. Now notice, if you deny it, let the danger light upon your charter and your city's freedom. And then he continues, and he says, you ask me why I choose to have a weight of carrion flesh than to receive 3,000 ducats. Remember, he's saying that the bond has not been paid back in the time and place in which it was supposedly executed, and he's entitled to his pound of flesh. So, in a sense, what he's saying, he stands upon a strict interpretation of the law. In other words, what he's trying to enforce is this idea of justice. He says that I carried out the dictates of my agreement, subject to the way the contract was written. So I am technically entitled to the pound of flesh. And it is his duty, Shylock claims, to seek justice. And after all, what he's going to say is that he's simply carrying out the dictates of what the Christians would have done if measures, in a sense, would have been reversed. So, if you want a kind of illustration of what I'm explaining to you here, move on down to about line 90 and, in a sense, look at his passage. Now, moving on in terms of the play, I want you to see at this time the arrival of Portia, and for that matter, Nerissa. And you remember why they have come, they have left Belmont, and they have made their way to Venice. Now, remember, Portia is acting too as a kind of a clerk. She actually, for all purposes, is a lawyer. And the notion is she's going to let it be known that she represents the law in one respect, and Shylock will in another respect. So, what she's going to do, now this would be a very difficult moment for her as well. So, in this regard, the two of them have something in common. When I say the two of them, I mean for all purposes, Shylock and Portia. It would have been an unusual situation for Shylock to enter into the court scene. And remember, I think almost more so for Portia. Now, she's never been here, and she's never experienced this moment. And what I think is somewhat remarkable about her is that she's got to be a bit spontaneous, and she's got to look over her audience and almost instinctively make up her mind as to what her approach will be. See, she likely hasn't had any opportunity to go over in great detail some kind of overdone legal briefs. So she's resting a little bit on her own, shall we say, mind, her own intelligence, her own innate ability. So she will first of all, of course, look at Shylock, and then out of a kind of personal curiosity, don't you think that she would want to look over and you have present Antonio and Bassanio. So I would call your attention to one of the most important passages in terms of Act 4. Go to about line 180. Now, after a while, she will have had an opportunity to decide how she's going to proceed in these undertakings. So, one of the things that she's going to do is she understands that Shylock is asking for justice, but she's going to play it a little bit differently. She's going to make a plea to Shylock, and she's going to say, I am going to extend something to you beyond justice. And she's going to offer him a quality that I would think for the most part, all want to embrace, and that is, quote, the quality of mercy. So I begin the passage as it reads. She says, the quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as a gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes. Now notice, 'tis mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throne monarch better than his crown. See, she's saying, if you will embrace mercy, you will be a much better person. It is a gift beyond measure. And then she said, again, I repeat just for emphasis, 'tis mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throne monarch better than his crown. His scepter shows the force of temporal power, the attribute to awe and majesty, wherein doth set the dread and fear of kings. But mercy is above this sceptred sway. See, it is enthroned in the hearts of kings. It is an attribute to God himself. So I move down just a little bit. She says, therefore, Jew, though justice be thy plea, consider this, that in the course of justice none of us shall see salvation. We do pray for mercy, and that same prayer doth teach us all to render the deeds of mercy. So one of the things that she's going to say is, okay, maybe in a kind of legalistic way, you're right. But why don't you rise above what you're asking for in a strict legal interpretation, and be a better man by showing compassion, showing a kind of humility, if you will. All right? And then very clearly, she's saying, why don't you take a chance? And you almost will outbest Antonio, Bassanio, and others by rising above, shall we say, their level, because you're going to show a quality of mercy that maybe under different circumstances they may not show. And also, the notion is maybe if you demonstrated this attribute, this feeling of mercy, you might not any longer feel the isolation of, shall we say, the Venetian society. In other words, maybe you could be accepted back into this society. Remember, as we had begun the play, I said for all purposes that as you look at Shylock, he very much is viewed as this alien, some kind of physical outcast in terms of the play. So she's saying, show mercy and demonstrate this quality, and you will be a better person. Now, I'd like for you to get Shylock's response. This is about line 210. Shylock says, "My deeds upon my head, I crave the law, the penalty and forfeit of my bond." So, for all purposes, he's not going to be moved. He says, no, I want justice. You remember when we had begun the play, I offered you as a kind of thematic concern this idea of what justice, how justice is defined in terms of what Portia represents, and how justice is defined in terms of what Shylock represents. So remember, he thinks a path to heaven, that he must, it is his duty to insist on this strict interpretation of justice. Don't, in other words, abide by the strict interpretation of the letter of the law. Don't take into account, shall we say, any kind of extenuating circumstances. It is what it is. The letter of the law must be observed. So if you move on down a little bit, maybe look at about line 25. She says, it must not be, there is no power in Venice can alter a decree established. See, she's not trying to say, I'm throwing out your contract. Your contract is very much legal. And Shylock is pleased. He says, a Daniel come to judgment. Yea, a Daniel. Now, probably, and you can check the footnote on Daniel, the idea here is he might be celebrating just a little bit, shall we say, too soon. So, move on down to about line 260 along in here, and notice what Portia is going to tell Shylock that he must do. Shylock, she will say, have by some surgeon, Shylock, on your charge to stop his wounds, lest he do bleed to death. And then Shylock says, it is so nominated in the bond. All right, so the notion is, we're going to go ahead and carry out the dictates of the bond. All right, now very importantly, we have to take into account the significance again of Portia's male disguise. All right, now I would call your attention maybe to about line 280, and look at this insight. Remember, I told you that Portia has to pay attention, of course, to Shylock and deal with what's going on in terms of enforcing the dictates of the contract. But also, she's got to be a bit curious about the relationship between Antonio and Bassanio. So I need you to mark about line 280, if you would, because this is going to have an influence on Portia. Bassanio says, Antonio, I am married to a wife which is as dear to me as life itself, but life itself my wife, and all the world are not with me esteemed above my life. I would lose all, I'll sacrifice them all, here to this devil to deliver you. Isn't that wonderful? Don't you see? This is Shakespeare at his best in his employment, if you will, of dramatic irony. Now look at the aside. Portia says, and once again I'm showing you why Portia must be viewed as a very formidable character in the play. She says, your wife would give you little thanks for that if she were by to hear you make the offer. Now, think about what's going to happen just momentarily. All right, now continue and move to a little past line 300. Shylock is insisting. Now, I like to see that Portia, you remember how she did with Bassanio? She says, okay, before you make your choice, why don't you tarry a little bit? Let's think about this before you make your choice. And you remember what Bassanio said? I live upon the rack. I'm ready right now. All right, Shylock is too. He's so self-assured. He's so self-controlled that he knows, in a sense, what he thinks is going to happen. So he says about line 310, most learned judge, a sentence. Come, prepare. And do mark what Portia says. And here's your moment. Tarry a little. There is something else. This bond doth give thee here no jot of blood. The words expressly are a pound of flesh. Take then thy bond. Take thou pound of flesh. You're entitled to it. Remember, a pound of your fair flesh. That is the extent of the language of the contract. Now notice, see what she's able to do? She hasn't altered the contract at all. What she has done is to find what we would call today in legalistic proceedings a kind of loophole. And she says, okay, go ahead. But in cutting it, if thou dost shed one drop of Christian blood, thy lands and goods are by the laws of Venice confiscate unto the state of Venice. There's his moment of defeat. Hence, the idea, look, what I'm showing you here is clearly, if you will, this enactment of poetic justice. Shylock will fall, if you will, victim to his own doings. He wanted a most literal interpretation of the law, and he has been given that. But there has been that great moment of reversal. Remember what I told you, that as you look in terms of wanting to classify the play as, shall we say, as tragic comedy, one thing that must happen is that you have to have this contrast between exalted virtue and deep-rooted villainy. For all purposes, we see throughout this trial that almost everyone present has looked upon Shylock as a kind of villainous character. So, for all purposes, Shylock has lost. Now, what I want you to do from about lines 350 to 380 along in there, notice how they will exact punishment upon Shylock. And I think you can read this very clearly for yourselves. What I want to call your attention to will be about line 380. Now, you can imagine that in terms of the 16th century, they would be very, very much pleased by the punishment that will be administered to Shylock. But centuries after would have been a little less, shall we say, condemning of Shylock. In other words, they would have wanted maybe Shylock to have been given just a little bit more compassion, a little bit more understanding. So mark about line 380 where Antonio speaks. So please, my lord, the Duke and all the court, and read into this. In other words, for all purposes, some would say that Antonio himself is showing a little bit of compassion and understanding. But I think we have to take this into account. Don't you want to think that Antonio does bear some responsibility, really, by his behavior for turning Shylock, in a sense, against him? In other words, some would readily say that all of this is not entirely the fault of Shylock. Remember, part of what you've got to recognize in terms of the play, once again, another interpretation, is that Shylock very much is a victim of this vacillating, hypocritical, and I'm going to use this word, oozing hypocrisy of Venetian Christian society. Now, there's a great line, and I don't want it misinterpreted. It's really one sentence, and let me try to find it for you as I look in terms of my text. It's going to be about line 395. You have one line. Shylock is asked, does he understand? And he says, I am content. Now, I want to provide a kind of interpretation, if you will, because what he means by this line, some say that he's, in a sense, acquiescing to what has happened in terms of his defeat. But if you will look at it a little bit clearer, actually read between the lines a little bit, I think for all purposes, when he says, I am content, it is a statement of what I call helpless acceptance. There's no choice. All right. Now, it's the idea that, of course, he's not pleased by what has happened, but in a sense, his hands are tied. What can he do about it? All right. Now, all of that business of, work this into your idea of the theme of gain. You remember, part of what we see in terms of Shylock, maybe a little bit in terms of, as we're going to find out very shortly, in terms of Antonio, gain has translated into this idea of power and money. Remember, for all purposes, that Shylock never wanted to spend any time investing in the person. It was always about himself. You remember how he, at a time in the play, would actually take money in the same sense that he had lost his money and he had lost his daughter, but he looked upon both of them as a kind of commodity. He never valued the importance of the person. Found this out as we looked at the suitors in terms of the casket scene or the chest scene. All right. Now, some would say, for all purposes, the play itself is over. Okay. Shakespeare really did not need to write a fifth act. When you finish Act 4, the villain gets his just desserts. He's foiled. He's exposed. He's no longer going to be, if you will, a threat. But understand that you do have to pay attention to the fifth act of the play, because if you don't pay attention to the fifth act of the play, you're not going to have the needed resolution that I have insisted upon as we had begun our study of Shakespeare. His plays demand, for the most part, a kind of resolution, or at least the beginning of resolution. See? So, I now call your attention to a very important moment. This is in preparation for the fifth act. And if you would go to about line 330, well, actually, I'm going to go above about line 325. All right. Now, remember, when I had introduced you to this idea of disguise, I said it's very important for the character to maintain his, her disguise. Remember, we talked about this in terms of As You Like It. Rosalind holds on to her disguise most carefully, and she will only reveal her identity until the right moment. Some say she might have held it a little bit too long. I don't particularly agree with that. Same thing has got to be true of Portia. Now, look what's going to happen about line 425. The idea is they owe her something, so as to speak. So Bassanio says, "Dear sir of force, I must attempt you further. Take some remembrance of us as a tribute, not as a fee. Grant me two things, I pray you, not to deny me and to pardon me." And then Portia, they play right into her hands. She says, "You press me far, and therefore I will yield." And then notice what she says to Antonio. "Give me your gloves. I will wear them for your sake." And look at Bassanio. "And for your love, I'll take the ring from you. Do not draw back your hand. I'll take no more, and you in love shall not deny me this." All right. Remember, I've been telling you all along that, for all purposes, Bassanio at best has been a kind of problematic hero. He's never performed any kind of heroic function. Now, in order for him to be a suited, shall we say, husband to Portia, he truly has got to undergo, in the classical sense, a moment of atonement. All right. Can you imagine what a great test she is imposing upon Bassanio? You remember when we discussed in the last video, you remember his arrogance about taking over the household? Now he's the man in charge. And look again how shrewd she is. She says, "I will have nothing else but only this, and now methinks I have a mind to it." Now, note the importance of the symbolism of the ring. The ring is symbolic of an oath of commitment. It is symbolic of, certainly, an oath of love. And the idea is she's testing, really, how sincere are you in terms of your feelings for me? So he says, if you'll move on down past about line 435, "The dearest ring in Venice will I give you, and find it out by proclamation. Only for this I pray you, pardon me." All right, so she's saying, "No, I want this ring." Now look, here's our problem. Go to about line 450. See, this is going to be one of the reasons why we can't end the play with Act 4. Notice, go to line 450 and mark this line by Antonio. Antonio says, "My lord Bassanio, let him have the ring. Let his deservings and my love withal be valued against your wife's commandment." All right. Now look what he's asking. He may want this devotion. He may want this feeling. He may want this relationship between the two of them given back to him. So look what he's saying in a sense. Can you imagine when Portia hears this, how she must feel? The notion is, once again, look at it. Let his deservings and my love withal be valued against your wife's commandment. She's not here. Pay no attention. No one will know the difference. All right, don't you see if the play ended here? What a sense of incomplete. It would be incomplete. All right, Bassanio has got to be taught a lesson. See, work it in with this idea of gain. Remember, that which is material, that which is the person. In other words, who cares about the ring? It's just a physical, concrete object. Pay no attention to it. All right, so I contend for all purposes, you need to pay a little bit of attention, if you will, to the fifth act. Now, that I see nothing I want to call your attention to here. As I conclude the fourth act, pay attention to the whole business of the ring story. It's going to act. The ring story is going to symbolize, if you will, in terms of the play, an act of deliverance. All right. Now, I'm about ready to momentarily call your attention to a few points, if you will, in Act 5, and then conclude the play. But I told you that after I had finished Act 4, I wanted to call your attention to something that I want to do before you go, if you will, and take the major exam next week. I'm going to try another experiment. I hope these videos are working out for you. I'm not finding them as I give more and more videos. I think I'm becoming increasingly more comfortable, and I hope I'm providing you, again, under these trying circumstances, a degree of assurance, and I'm doing really my very best to sort of salvage the course, really, for the both of us. So I think on Monday, I'm going to ask you at 9 o'clock to zoom in, and I say 9 o'clock because technically, if I were zooming, that would be the logical time for the class. So I won't insist, but I will encourage you. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the exam. So let's tune in, if you can zoom in, on Monday, and I would appreciate this on your part. Now, what I'm going to announce, just in case there's maybe a couple of you have taken on a job responsibility, and no longer is 9 o'clock that convenient, I will tell you that in the course of next week, I'm going to online submit the major exam. I will probably do this on Tuesday, and it will be due Wednesday evening by midnight. And I'm not going to go through Blackboard. What I want to do, you will be given the exam, and what you want to do is to transpose it into a formal attachment. And then by midnight on Wednesday, send it to me. And I've had no difficulty. For example, you did fine with submitting your questions when I gave you questions over the Merchant of Venice, though that wasn't a formal attachment. This, as a major exam, should be. Now, you must respect my deadline. If you get the exam on Tuesday, then I'm giving you more than enough time, for example, than you would have had in a class situation. I'm going to modify the format a little bit, again, to benefit both of us. I'm going to omit any kind of, shall I say, objective question. There will be quotations for you to analyze, and there will be essay questions. So I want you to give very, very good detailed answers to an analysis of passages from the play. And then there'll be 2 essay questions, and you need to write on both of them. So this likely will take you several pages, but once again, this is going to be an opportunity, if you will, for you to improve if you had a little bit of difficulty with the first exam. So do try to tune in if you can. Zoom in on Monday at 9 o'clock. Now, let's go on to Act 5 and finish the play itself. And some of you may have figured out by now, some of you may have not, but my important claim to you in terms of our looking at Act 5 very briefly is this. I would not have done justice to my lecture about the 4 classifications of the play if I don't pay a little bit of attention, if you will, to Act 5. Act 5 returns this comedy, this tragicomedy, if you will, back to the idea of romantic comedy. See? So that's one of the reasons. See, what these critics want to do in saying, oh, Shakespeare didn't know that he didn't need to include Act 5. Well, you do need to Act 5, because still the play is an example of romantic comedy. So now we're going to return to Belmont. And one of the great moments is this. I want you to go into Act 5. And in terms of Act 5, it's a rather lengthy act. But gosh, go to about line 215. And Bassanio is back home. Now, once again, remember, in fact, Portia and Nerissa would have gotten home first. And notice the serenity of these scenes. Notice again the calmness. See, can you imagine the trial scene as we ended Act 4? Now remember, I told you that anytime we deal with Belmont, there's always going to be this feeling of calmness and serenity. Now, if you look about line 215, Bassanio knows none of what has happened in terms of Act 4. All right, and one of the things that we've got to do is make complete the message of the casket scenes. All right, now, how about line 210 or 215? What should I say, sweet lady? I was enforced to send it after him. I was beset with shame and courtesy. My honor would not let ingratitude so much be smeared. Pardon me, good lady, for by these blessed candles of the night, had you been there, isn't that great? I think you would have begged the ring of me to give the worthy doctor. God, I think he's a rather presumptuous character. All right, now, Portia, I like. Please mark her passage. Look what she says. All right, I've got to teach you something about relationships. And this is why I said a moment ago that the message of the casket or the chess scenes will be complete. Now look, Bassanio, for all purposes, has made the right choice. But he, in making the right choice, it ties in beautifully, if you will, with the theme of appearance and reality. Even though he's made the right choice, he does not understand fully the nature of his commitment. So, look at Portia. Let not that doctor e'er come near my house, since he hath got the jewel that I loved, and that which you did swear to keep from me, I will become as liberal as you. So she says, okay, we'll play your game. She says, what she's doing is to threaten him in a sense. And when I say she threatens him, she's going to threaten him. She says, okay, you want to violate sexual exclusiveness. I can do the same thing. See, this is great. I think that this is just a classic moment. All right. Now, if you'll move on down, I think she's done what she's supposed to do. Go down to about line 245 and look what Bassanio says. Nay, but hear me. Pardon this fault, and by my soul I swear I never more will break an oath with thee. And then look at Antonio. I once did lend my body for his wealth, which but for him that had your husband's ring had quite miscarried. I dare be bound again, my soul upon the forfeit, that your Lord will never more break faith advisedly. He has to acknowledge that he does not have a claim to first priority over their relationship. See, he thought that he did. He does not. So, for all purposes, I think that this play, as I have tried to teach you throughout the semester, ends with what we've called before, with a kind of comic harmony. The play is going to end with, on a note of affirmation. All right? Now, I want to say this about human relationships. I think you would all agree that human relationships are much stronger than perhaps their outward signs. All right? Now, I like the fact. I guess this is a kind of point that I want to make. Not only has Portia taught, I think, Bassanio a very important lesson. Now, I think he will redeem himself, and he's learned, okay, he really is not any kind of heroic character in the play. All right? Now, what some do is to feel very sorry for Antonio. I don't feel sorry for him at all. Shakespeare's function for Antonio, and if I taught you 3391, I think now you can make a good understanding. Antonio becomes what I consider to be a kind of emotional successor in Lear. Lear's going to make the mistake in judging between the material and the spiritual. All right? So if I were just teaching a course in Shakespeare without this division, I would likely have taught the Merchant of Venice, and then immediately, if you will, I would go into King Lear. All right, now, I repeat, the play does end on a note of comic harmony. And once again, Antonio understands the bond clearly between Portia and Bassanio. And look, just because you go and give somebody a gift, I don't really think you have the right that because you do this for somebody, they have to, in return, reciprocate. See, this is what Antonio thought should be given to him. He's saying, for all purposes, look what I did for you. Now, in return, you do something for me. That's not the way it works. Now, my concluding comment is this. When I say again for the third or fourth time that the play is going to end on this note of comic harmony, I think really, and I talk about this business of relationships, a very important part of a relationship, I think, is a relationship is going to survive if the two parties can achieve a sense of humor. And I think that this is one of the things that, for all purposes, Portia is doing too. She does threaten him, but also she's doing it in a kind of teasing way. There is no malice whatsoever. She's warning him very gently, but at the same time, there is this moment of laughter. So I think there's perfect resolution in terms of the Merchant of Venice. Now, I think you have been given all of the information that you possibly need, and this unusual, I suppose, circumstance. So I conclude our session, our video for today, and when you have an opportunity, do watch it before you take the test next week. And then again, I remind you, please Zoom in Monday at 9 o'clock. Really have a very good weekend. I realize that it is, depending on your religious affiliation, this is a very important time for many reasons for all of us. And once again, I think and I hope and I pray that we will beat what has befallen us. So have a very good weekend, and I hope to see you on Monday. Thank you very much.